Okay, well, I think I'll just start. Okay, thank you all for coming here. We're very pleased to have Marie-Claire Lim Moore to come and speak to us about her 2 books. She has 2 books published so far, but I expect there'll be more in the future. I wouldn't be surprised. The first is called Don't Forget the Soap, and the second one is called Don't Forget the Parsley. These are both the library's copies, and they look like I borrowed them to make sure they'd be here so I could show them to you. But after the talk, I'll return them, and anybody can, first person to get it from the shelf will be able to borrow it. Okay, these books are also for sale at the back of the room. We have, and they cost 100 Hong Kong dollars each at a discounted price for HKUST. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the talk is being recorded by RVC, so during Q&A, please use a microphone. Now it's time to talk about our wonderful speaker, Ms. Lim Moore. She goes casually by the name of Claire, so that's easier to remember. And she was born in Vancouver to parents who had emigrated from the Philippines. While she was still in primary school, they moved to New York City, where she attended the United Nations International School. Okay. After getting her BA at Yale, she became a banker with Citibank, and she traveled the world. And while she was doing that, she also got an EMBA from Fordham University. She is very international. She met her husband when she was working in Sao Paulo, Brazil. They got married in the Philippines, and then shortly after that, they settled in Singapore, where she was managed the global client business for Citibank in Asia. Okay, now she is based in Hong Kong, where she is a working mother to 3 children. And until this autumn, she was the development director at the Women's Foundation. But just a few weeks ago, she became the head of Visa Consulting, that's the credit card company, for Hong Kong and Taiwan. And in the meantime, she continues to live and love and work and gives talks about work-life balance. So please join me in welcoming Marie-Claire Lim Moore.
Hello, everyone. We're just gonna get my mic on. But it's really nice to be here.
Sorry, it should be on.
Okay, we're good.
Oh,
yeah, perfect. Okay, so let me just start by thanking Tori and HKUST. Actually, so Victoria and I met about a year ago at a college alumni event. So it's really fitting to be back meeting up with her on campus. You have such a beautiful campus. It's actually really a treat to be here with all of you. So over the next, say, half hour, I'm going to share some stories from my personal professional life that I hope resonates with many of you. But before doing that, I will start with some audience participation. Just because I did hear about a recent study done, and I wanted to see if it would resonate with some of you all as well. So this study was done by an Australian insurance company. And what they did was they asked, a group of people like yourselves, how many of you would lend your home to your best friend for the week? So can anyone guess what percentage said yes? Any ideas? 10% we have. Anyone think? 80%. That's big range. Okay, so the answer for the home, lending your home, was actually 80%. So
wow.
Yeah, quite generous, let's just say. Okay, then they asked the same group of people, what percentage of you would lend your car to your best friend for the week? What do you guys think? 90? Tori's
No, I'm thinking less.
Okay, so the answer for car, for some reason, was 60%. And it might be, who knows, this was an insurance company doing this, so there might have been some, aspect of if they're covered or not. Okay, then they asked the women, and this was all professional women, who would lend their wardrobe to their friend for the week. And this included, their shoes, handbags, all of that. For the week. What do you guys think? 5?
Less than 10.
Less than 10. Okay. Interestingly enough, women, I get more generous than they would have thought. It was actually 90%. Oh, maybe they thought there would be an exchange and they get it back. Okay. Now, then they asked, and they didn't give any context. They just said, how many of you would lend your partner for the week? Little risque, or maybe they just thought this could be their partner to help move things. Who knows? But they just left it open-ended. What do you think they said? Any guesses? Lending your partner for the week.
30%.
Okay, 50%. I know. I'm gonna say it's like, who knows about these Aussies? But I'm just joking. It's actually, it was an Australian bank who shared this information. Okay, then lastly, they asked how many of you would lend your mobile phones for the week. Your best friend. Thoughts?
If I have an alternative, I'll lend it to.
An alternative phone. No, the phone you use every day for the week.
1+10.
It was 5%. So yeah, you guessed that about right. So that's interesting, right? So you have so many people they would lend, up to their wardrobe, their car, their home, but this attachment that everyone has to their mobile phones speaks volumes. And I think that a lot of talk or a lot of advice about living your best life kind of starts with detaching yourself from your mobile phone and kind of living in the moment, right? And people actually say that, I don't know if I believe this, but they say the holidays you remember the most are the holidays where you don't take photos. So I don't know, that's just food for thought. But don't worry, I'm actually, it would be really hypocritical of me to encourage you all to give up your phones. So I'm actually not going to focus on those areas at all, but was curious to see where you thought we would land. So there's a lot of advice out there about living your best life. If you Google the phrase, you'll find so many tips, things, lists, everyone from Oprah Winfrey to Richard Branson, Virgin, all kind of telling you why and how to live your best life. But this is actually something, my parents were showing me consistently, at home. And actually the name of, so my second book, Don't Forget the Parsley, it actually comes from, this idea that my parents, new immigrants to the US and Canada, but we never had very fancy meals at all. But my mother would, even if this could be, she would be getting out of a can, corned beef, she would still, make it with cut up potatoes and tomatoes, make it nice, and always add a garnish, like a parsley. And so whenever we were setting the table and we'd sit down for dinner, she'd kind of always say, don't forget the parsley, which just meant it's the little things also that kind of add flavor to your life. And we all do this in many different ways, but that's just an example. So while I didn't grow up in Asia, as Victoria mentioned, I'm actually stereotypically Asian when it comes to family. So I love the respect given to elders, the big weekly family gatherings, and the fact that no one's fazed when I say my parents are staying for weeks or months, at a time. Oops, sorry about that. Oh, there we go. So they often do. They often come to Hong Kong and stay for a couple of months. And thankfully, my husband, who is not Asian, but appreciates that as well. And now that I have a family of my own, I've often found myself thinking about what I've learned from my parents and from my childhood, and all of the different aspects of my life and how that's shaped me today. So let me just start by telling you a little bit about my mother. Okay, so I consider myself very lucky because growing up with my mother, I saw how you could pursue career and family at the same time. So every night she would, have dinner with us. She would also continuously give back to the community. She had her own business. She was an artist and she was a teacher. And I could see the way it was possible when you manage your time to kind of manage these aspects of your life. And I always appreciated this about her, but especially after having kids of my own, I have this, great new appreciation and admiration for how she's done this. So I decided to write a book about this when I was on maternity leave in Singapore. So Don't Forget the Soap is actually a story about people who have inspired me, first and foremost my mother. And I know the title might not resonate right away, but the underlying themes of the book are having balance, finding balance, having gratitude, and giving back. And my stories are about being inspired to do all three. And I will just share a little bit. So I told you the inside scoop of Don't Forget the Parsley. Now, Don't Forget the Soap is also advice that my mother would give. And this came from, as we were growing up, we would never kind of stay at hotels. If we traveled anywhere, it would be by car and we'd stay with family. And once I started traveling for work, there would be those fancy soap and shampoo bottles. And I found, I'd take that, put it in my suitcase, bring it back. And when I would go to the Philippines, I would kind of share that as a souvenir along with a little other present. And it was always so well received. It was just a nice, whether people were happy that I thought of them or it was fancy from another country, they appreciated this. And there was one period when I was living in Brazil. I was living in a hotel for about 6 months, so you can imagine how much soap I could accumulate. But at some point, I kind of, just stopped doing it, got too busy. And when my mother came to visit over Christmas, she also was saying, okay, so where's the soap? I'm gonna go back to the Philippines. And I told her, I think I brushed it off, kind of saying, oh, just don't have time for that anymore. And I never feel like I've actually disappointed my parents too much in my life, but at that moment, I could see that her heart sank a little bit, not because, literally I forgot the soap, but it just seemed like I forgot where I came from or forgot my roots. And so that was just another reminder and from where that comes from. So my mother wasn't inspiring in your traditional kind of way. So this is, I don't know if some of you remember Steve Jobs from Apple and a speech he gave at Stanford University. This was a few years ago. And it became iconic in a way because he put out there, like, the only way to do great work is to do what you love. And interestingly, this is totally something my parents would never say. So I think also because they were new immigrants, they, they were very practical, so they wanted me to be financially independent as soon as I could be, and then figure out a way to do what you love. But this did not mean there was no room, for passion, because my mother, she was always incredibly passionate about art. So she studied fine arts in the Philippines, and she always wanted to pursue this. But what she did for practical reasons, she was a teacher at the United Nations International School in New York. But she always found ways to still incorporate art into her life, whether it was curating the United Nations International School exhibit, or getting all the teachers who on their side did photography and other things and kind of put an exhibit together like that in the staff lounge. And she also pursued her art in the evenings. So she would spend every day with 18 5-year-olds and then come home, work on a church fundraiser while my brother and I did our homework, and then sit down for dinner with everybody. And then she was off to the art studio working on her pieces. And eventually, her work became picked up by prominent members of the United Nations community, including, this is the then Secretary General Kofi Annan. And so, this is just a matter of her kind of continuing to do what she's passionate about. On the side, it kind of morphed into a second career while she was, doing her day job. And that was something that I always saw and admired, and I think part of what I started to do as well. So, as you can imagine, when I would say things like, you know, one day when I stop working, I can finally focus on the book I want to write. Because I was thinking for many years, you know, one day I want to write a book about my parents' immigration from Asia to Canada and the US. And I'd say, like, who knows, maybe one day I'll retire and do that. My mother would tell me, like, there's no need to wait, you know, you can just manage your time and you can figure out a way to do it while working. And, you know, she said, trust me, it will be that much more rewarding. So I found this window of opportunity while I was on maternity leave, as I said, in Singapore. And admittedly, if I were to say this in the US, they might kind of kick me out of the room because it is much harder to find time in a Western place when you don't have the great help that you do here. So I'm very grateful, you know, to live in Asia, very grateful that I had the help that I did. And so I wrote most of the book, my first book, with my newborn kind of sleeping on my lap. And then because of all the informal kind of networking I was doing, I had a professional kind of editor, book designer, and publicist all ready to help me launch my book. And as a result of all the support I received, the book kind of came out and surprised me as far as how well it was received. So it topped you know, Amazon's list in the parenting and women's memoir categories, and then it was picked up by press and social media, and then a whole bunch of opportunities followed that I would have, you know, never imagined. So, you know, once again, my mother turned out to be right, because writing the book, you know, when I did, was more fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. And I'm always going to be grateful to her for kind of instilling that confidence in me to focus on this passion anyway, even with my day job at City and my young kids at home. So this worked out quite well for me, that by the time I had my third child, I thought about, you know, now I want to write a book about my dad. So the second book does have more stories about my father. And he's also played a really influential role in my life. And some of the biggest life lessons I've learned have been from my dad. So what I wanted to do now, if you let me, is just read an excerpt from my book, because I think it pretty much sums up my father. Okay, so one of the biggest lessons I've learned from my father is never be intimidated by anyone. He still puts his pants on one leg at a time, my father will say. Many, many years ago, when I was going to my first NSYNC concert, my father heard me shrieking about the idea of seeing Justin Timberlake in person. No need to get so excited. The guy still puts his pants on one leg at a time, he'd say. And then years later, I remember telling him that I was anxious about meeting former US President Jimmy Carter on a Habitat for Humanity project. And he said, again, don't be nervous, he still puts his pants on one leg at a time. So that always kind of stuck with me. And this quality of my father's has really served him well. So my parents would have never made it into Canada without it, I'm sure. Anyone who's crossed a border knows how standoffish immigration officers can be. You can have all the documents required, you can have every reason to be there, you might even be a citizen, but it can still be a nerve-wracking experience. Much more so when you're on the brink of overstaying your visa and trying to get entry into the new country, which was the case for my parents. I'm sorry, we're going to have to decline, the immigration officer said, closing the file, and my mother stood up. Can I ask why we're not being approved? My father wasn't going anywhere. Unfortunately, I can't approve your application because you don't have enough work experience, the immigration officer explained before ending the conversation. But that's a good thing, my father put on his positive spin. The immigration officer looked very confused and vaguely intrigued. And then my father continued. No experience also means no negative experience. Companies can mold me from scratch. They can train me from the bottom up. This is true, the officer conceded, but it's just a tough job market right now. You'll be hard-pressed to find someone who will even open the door. But then I'll knock on another door, my father argued with conviction. And if that doesn't work, I'll try another, and another. And eventually I'll find a company that would be thrilled to have someone like me. The immigration officer realized my father wouldn't let up on this one, and he needed another reason to decline. I believe that may very well be true, but the fact of the matter is we're just not accepting very many applicants to Vancouver at this time. He stood up again. My father stayed seated. Well, how about Montreal? The immigration officer sat down and opened the file. It doesn't say anywhere here you speak French, he commented as he closed it and attempted to stand up once more. My mother followed. Oui, oui, je parle français. My father confidently said one of the 5 French phrases he knew. The immigration officer cracked a smile. I appreciate the effort, but I don't think so. I'm sorry, but I have to take the next interview. My mother, the constant rule follower, stood for the 3rd time as the officer did, and my father gestured for her to sit down again. Officer, Montreal was really our first choice, but we have friends in Vancouver who have been convincing us to join them. But if there's no more spaces in Vancouver, we'd like to be considered for Montreal. With my skills and my persistence, I'll be able to get a job there. My father was convincing. The immigration officer sighed. Oh, okay, let me see if I can get one of the French-speaking colleagues to interview you. And he started dialing a number. My mother was horrified, since she knew my father's French capabilities, or lack thereof. But my father remained cool as a cucumber. He's not there, let me try someone else. The immigration officer said, now dialing a series of numbers. Then there was a knock at the door. Excuse me, officer, I need to send in the next interview, the assistant said. All right, I can't reach anyone, I really have to move this along. He stamped the documents, and the rest is history. My father always says that more often than not, you have a 50-50 shot. His philosophy is that if one person's determining your fate, you have to give it everything you've got. So this was just, I think for both my mother and my father, I've learned kind of these life lessons that I've taken with me in all aspects of my life. So between those lessons and my own experiences, I thought what I do now is kind of share 5 things that have been working for me when it comes to living my best life. Okay, so the first one. Okay, we talked about this a little bit, but do what you love. So I have this is forget, do what you love, live a life of purpose. So do what you love has become, at least in my time, the unofficial work mantra. And between Steve Jobs, I mentioned Oprah, everyone who seems to deliver a commencement speech, doing what you love is the only way to live. But you know, most people who do what you love have an integrated life. They don't consider work to be work because what they love what they do, and what they do professionally is what they care about personally. So not surprisingly, most people who do what they love also tend to be financially comfortable, right? So it's not saying that they're necessarily multimillionaires, but yeah, their lifestyle may be partly subsidized. Their spouse may earn enough so they can pursue their passion, or they may know that one day they'll inherit, you know, a multi-million-dollar apartment that their parents bought from a fraction of that amount decades ago. But it is something, you know, that has resonated with me. And there was a provoking article written in Slate magazine a couple of years ago. And in this article, the writer says that do what you love is for the privileged few with wealth, social status, education, and political clout. She goes as far as to say, do what you love is a secret handshake of the privileged and a worldview that disguises its elitism as noble self-betterment. So that's kind of a mouthful, and I don't necessarily know if I agree with all of that, but I do know this. While doing what you love is a lovely idea, the fact of the matter is that most people won't be able to have the luxury to go right into doing what they love. And you know, I just think if you can't find a job that you love right away, you can learn to find meaning and success in the job that you have. And that's been the case for me in many of the jobs I've had. Now, one of the first things that struck me about my husband Alex, who is in this photo, was that he was one of the first people I knew, aside from my very practical parents, who didn't quite buy into this idea of do what you love. So he would always say, you don't need to do what you love, you just need to have a purpose. Now, Alex grew up in a small town in upstate New York, which in North America, it's actually closer to Canada. It was about half an hour away from Canada. It was a town of about 100 people, and he would always joke that when their postman retired, they got a new zip code. It was very, very small. And he loved growing up there. You know, they knew everybody, all their neighbors at the market. It's, you know, as you can imagine, a really close, tight community. But he also kind of had aspirations of later in life, you know, moving to the big city and getting, you know, a job on Wall Street, you know, having a family. And he didn't see anyone where he grew up who kind of followed or could lead that path for him. So he was just always trying to think of, like, how would I do that on my own? And he ended up going, I think, for a school trip to West Point Military Academy in the US. And you guys familiar? I find like a lot of sometimes there are a number of Asian students at West Point, interestingly. And so it's a leading US military academy. It is quite rigorous, both academically and also in just their training. And so, you know, my husband kind of saw that even though the last thing he would want to do is be in the Army, he saw this as just a window for opportunity and access and all the great challenges ahead. So he made it a personal goal to get into the school, and he did. But anyone who knows Alex, my husband, knows that he's the most unlikely fit. He never liked being told what to do. He would often challenge authority, and he really wasn't clean cut. But he always says he can do anything when he knows it's for a greater purpose. And so today, you know, Alex is the country treasurer for Citibank Hong Kong, and he's great at his job, but I still don't think he would classify it as doing what you love. At least for him, equally important as loving the job is loving the impact your job has on others. So this can mean internal clients who benefit from the work his team is doing, or it can refer to family he's able to support. And my parents have always had this similar point of view. As I mentioned, as new immigrants, they weren't necessarily doing jobs they loved, but they were doing great work and they were living a meaningful life. Their jobs supported our family, allowing us to spend time together and providing us with opportunities to give back to the community in a regular way. So the point here is that not everyone can quit their job to pursue their passion, but great if you can. Most of us have to find ways to integrate the two. For me, one definition of success has become achieving an integrated life, and writing my books has allowed me to integrate my personal and professional life. I think it's essentially simulated, you know, do what you love for me. So they've added this other dimension, like I can be head of consulting at Visa, but then in the middle of the day come out and talk and meet so many of you and hear from people about really what their aspirations are and kind of stay connected in that way. I've also kind of, you know, broadened my world outside of my industry, and this has allowed me to be better at my job. And this has just been something I can't emphasize more that's really kind of worked for me. The second thing I have there is succeeding on your own terms. So while I was working in New York, the general counsel for my business, his name was Neil Barry, so he coined a nickname for me, and this was in the office, and it was Sunshine. He said, "You're always just so upbeat and happy." And, you know, upbeat and happy was great, but Sunshine was not the nickname I wanted as I was working my way up the corporate ladder. It didn't exactly give off a serious businesswoman vibe, you know. So since then, I've come to realize that, you know, so what? I generally have a cheerful disposition, but that doesn't stop me from being great at what I do. And in fact, it can actually be part of what makes me effective at what I do. So as cliche as it sounds, there's this piece of advice from someone named Judy Garland, which has come to resonate with me now more than ever. And this is, always be a first-rate version of yourself instead of a second-rate version of somebody else. And that's something that I think kind of sticks with you all your life. So similarly, you have to be ready to make your own rules. When I was first considering a job in Singapore and I was living in New York, many people warned me about going to Asia at that time. They kind of said, you'll never be able to see your family. They work really late in Asia. You'll be at the office at all hours. Your kids are going to grow up thinking you're like their auntie, and you know this isn't the right time for you to do this. I'm really glad I didn't listen to them. It did turn out to be true, I will say. People in Asia work very, very late. So when I first got to Singapore, I followed what seemed to be the default schedule. So it meant a later start to what I was used to in New York, but it also meant a later end. And because I was managing this global business, I came home but was on the phone all night with New York. So after a few months, I realized I needed to change my schedule if I were to ever see my family. And you have to be comfortable with the fact that when you're a professional, you know what you need to do to get the job done. And being in the office when my kids were having dinner or going to bed was not a prerequisite for my job being done. So I made a schedule that worked for me and had no negative impact on my boss or my team. So I got to the office really early and I worked very efficiently, got home in time to have dinner with my kids, and then I went back online to answer emails and take calls after my kids went to bed. And this is still actually what I'm doing today. Had I listened to all the people telling me not to take this job while my kids were young, I would have missed out on this incredible opportunity to live and work in Asia. Okay, the next one I have here is do the weekly email challenge. So I bookmarked a great list I came across a couple years back. It's called How to Make Your Life Better by Sending 5 Simple Emails. And it was written by someone named Eric Barker. So the 5 emails he talked about, the first one had to do with happiness. And he said, every morning, send a friend, a family member, or a coworker an email to say thank you for something. The second one was job related. So at the end of the week, send your boss an email and sum up with what you've accomplished. The third was around growth. Once a week, email a potential mentor. The fourth one was friendship. Make time to email a good friend and make plans. And the fifth was career related. So send an email to someone you know, but don't know very well, and check in. The point is, you have to carve out time for your own betterment. And this is really easy to overlook when you have mountains of tasks in front of you every day. But if you invest this little time in yourself, everything else actually gets easier. The fourth one I have, okay, so this is combine something you don't like with something you look forward to doing. So this is very tactical, but it's really worked for me. So when I first started working and traveling, I didn't realize how much I would hate doing expense reports. So this is like the itemizing of your bills, photocopying of your receipts. There's all this involved with, I always had something better to do, more important to do. But I quickly realized that these were important. They could impact your credit report if you're late. You get all sorts of fees. It had to become a priority, but didn't mean I didn't like doing them. So what I started to do was I set out time once a month, like a night once a month, to do expense reports. But that was also the night that I would order sushi from my favorite Japanese place. And so this way, I still had to do this chore, but I was kind of looking forward to doing it because I was going to have my favorite sushi. So I found that is actually, a tactic I think my husband still uses with me. So he knows I'm not actually the biggest fan of exercise and running, even though I know it's good for you to do. But over the weekends, he'll plan like our family hikes or running, and then at the end, we get to try a new restaurant. So that's just one of those things I think you can kind of, add to just your daily life. Okay, and then this last one is just to make the point that little things can make a big difference. So do you guys know what that is? Apple charger. But it's not the 3-foot Apple charger that comes with your phone. It's the 6-foot Apple charger that you have to buy separately. And it's still only US dollars, $7.99. But just the impact that can have on your daily life, such a small thing, but it does add to making all the tedious things easier. Where I leave my phone, the fact that I can still do work on it while it's charged. And I think, like my mother with the Parsley, there are these small things that can make, a difference in your life. So let me just close by saying that, one of the best things that's come from writing my books has been connecting with even more people, like all of you today. So just thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Claire, for that stimulating and interesting talk. Now we have, we now can have Q&A. I also want to remind you that we also have copies of the book for sale in the back, or her books, or if you prefer the e-book experience.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. If you prefer the e-book experience, they're also available for sale on Amazon.com Kindle. But now we'll have some Q&A. So please just raise your hand and we'll pass around the microphones. Don't be shy.
Hello. I look at your profile and you graduated from Yale, this prestigious university in the world. So how does attending to the university impact your future life? Or does most of your valuable things absorbed from the school or from your practical workplace?
Okay. Yes. So did everyone hear the question? Yeah. So school versus personal and professional experience. So, one of the first things I will have to admit that going to a school like Yale, and Victoria did that too, is that you do have this amazing alumni network. Like even being able to be here today is because of my alumni network. And so I value tremendously the people who I've met, at Yale, including professors and teachers. But I will say, any professional experience I've had, you walk through the door, it might have helped, you get into the interview. People do have this idea and want to kind of bring you in, but no, everything, every promotion after, every kind of successful meeting afterwards had nothing to do with necessarily what school I went to. Certainly I learned a lot from there, but the practical experience, everyone kind of stresses that the organization, all the great organizations now really do tend to look at what you've been able to do, your output there on the job. But certainly the school networks, I think, and foundation is a great help.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Other question? You? Yeah? Oh, sorry.
Hello, thank you for sharing. I'm actually quite curious about why did you decide to go to banking after your graduation or after you finish your studies? Because I'm currently in year 3 of undergraduate program, so I want to know how can we explore what we want to do after graduation.
Yes. So there's a practical element of where I ended up. So on campus, a big factor is who comes to recruit, who you're meeting, who you get interviews with. And certainly there were a lot of banks or consulting firms that came on campus. But even among that, I was looking for, I didn't necessarily go into something like investment banking where I knew just my natural skill sets were not going to take me too far there. And I didn't actually appreciate the way the lifestyle looked. but I would combine, I knew that I had a strong kind of marketing and communications background, and so I was looking still for areas, even within the bank, being so big, there are areas that you can carve out where, at any organization, I think, some of what you're interested in will have a fit. And then while you're in the organization, you get exposed to so many other things too. So as an example, even if I joined Citi and started working on payments at the time, it was a co-branded credit card with an airline. So I got to learn a lot about the travel industry, about how banks make money through their credit cards. But I was always interested also in pursuing, other things, other interests in mine. And Citibank, being a big company, had a huge kind of foundation. And so I found myself volunteering to work on microfinance projects and things that were way outside of my day job. But that is the kind of the breadth and scope I felt like when I joined a big company I could still explore. Does it help?
Okay, thank you. Question over there?
Hi. How would you compare living in Singapore to living in the States?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought you were going to say Hong Kong. Everyone does the Singapore-Hong Kong comparison. So Singapore compared to the U.S. So when I moved to Singapore, it was shortly after the global financial crisis, and the U.S. was, to be totally blunt, kind of a drag in all aspects. The job market, just where, where politics were, everything. So there was a big pull to come to Asia. And in Singapore, it was really, and still is, kind of in that growth mode. So it was a kind of dynamic time, I think, both personally. I was also at the stage like starting a family, and professionally, so there were more work opportunities in Asia. So I think thankfully, some aspects of the economy in the US have gotten better as well, but the overall, the time being in Singapore when I was able to have my family was actually a better quality of life for me.
So then the next question is Singapore and Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Yeah, I knew it would get there at some point. Yeah, so I love Hong Kong. I do, not just saying that because I am in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is, it feels more like a New York City. It's a little bit faster paced, for better or worse. I think people are generally, in the workplace anyway, more stressed. And just like they are in New York. I found it a little bit less in Singapore. And I also just, I think it's an exciting time because frankly, like the proximity also to Greater China and everything that's kind of happening in they're calling it like the Pearl River Delta. There's so much going on, it's such a growth engine. And then I find the energy in Hong Kong just being very, very dynamic.
More questions?
Claire, thank you very much for your talk. We have a lot of students in here. So if I ask you one question, that is, while the students are still in college, in university, if you are going to give them a piece of advice, what would you like to give them?
Yeah, so I think for me, one piece of advice as a student that still resonated was that you can't plan your whole life, and so there's a lot, of course, that you have to go into strategically thinking about, who you should meet, what industries you'd be interested in working with. But I think even when you, all the best plans, end up where they have to be fluid and flexible, because there are just all these external factors that can happen in your life. And so I think the idea is that every opportunity that you're given to really maximize that, because eventually that turns into another opportunity that gets you closer, to where you want to be. So as students, I think there's a lot of focus on kind of planning your whole career and where you might want to be. But there's still a lot that happens once you get into the workplace.
Okay. I have, unless there's another question, I have one question too. More chances? Okay. Okay, one more question over there.
Thank you for your talk. I have two small questions. One is that you translated your book in Chinese, so more people or young people or the vocabulary is not good like me can know more and fully understand it. And the second is how about your PowerPoint online on a website so people could record it, re-watch it. Yes,
Very good idea, thank you. So I have to say, I was thrilled when I saw, Victoria showed me, that the HKUST stamp here, and it has got me thinking about translation. This actually came up about translating the book in Portuguese because I spent some time in Brazil, and this idea now of doing it in Chinese is actually a very good one that I will follow up on, so thank you for that. And in terms of online, yeah, I think that would be, if that's possible, I would be happy to support that.
Yes, and also this, the talk is being recorded, and then we'll make the PowerPoint available as well, with Claire's permission. And also she has a website as well where other, for example, a TED Talk she gave last year is also available. So thank you for that. Questions? Okay, well then I'll ask my final summarizing question, and that is, it's a question of identity. So you're a worker, you're a mother, you're a Canadian, you're an American, you're a resident of Hong Kong, of Filipina descent. And so, and you're talking about living an integrated life. And so I think for many students, and for many non-students, how one is able to pull them together into one. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that. I don't expect any final answer, but
philosophical answer. But I do get that question in different forms, and I think especially when it comes to my children, because of course they would be, everything you just described, having that. Plus, then they would look like they are half Asian, half Caucasian, the whole thing. And for me, identity is very important. And so while, like I said, I never grew up in Asia or the Philippines, I always felt still a strong tie and connection. So I think it is important to kind of pay tribute to each one of those. And it doesn't have to be as a, everything, but I think certain aspects of my life where Filipino traits and values still really resonate. I think just my experiences working abroad, kind of in an expat capacity, have also become part of my identity, and I take pride in many of those things. But then living in each place, whether it's Brazil or Singapore, Hong Kong, I do like to get integrated into that community. Working at the Women's Foundation of Hong Kong was a great way for me in Hong Kong to spend time at the local schools and to see how women and girls, were being empowered here. So I think it is, the short answer is I try to pay, again, tribute to all aspects of my identity, and I hope actually that my children will do so as well.
okay, well thank you. Thank you very much. And everyone, let's all thank Claire for this very interesting. As a token of our esteem, we're going to present her with a souvenir.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I turned off my mic. So. Okay. Well, here I'll give it to you first, and then I'll tell you that. Okay. So here you are.
Oh, thank you.
Here, Grace.
Oh,
Yes.
This over here.
Yeah. Maybe I left you. You.
Oh, come here, okay, okay. Sorry, good direction.
Yeah,
This
ready?
is also a very important skill to pick up.
Ready, 1, 2, here first, okay, here first, okay.
All right.
Thank you. This is our 25th anniversary notebook, and it also has, you can write in it, and it also has images from our special collections. So thank you, students, very much for coming. And as Claire will stay a couple more minutes, and as I mentioned, there's books over there if you choose to purchase any. So have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.